مساكم الله بالخير مشاهدينا الكرام، احييكم في هذه الحلقة الجديدة من برنامج تحت المجهر. حلقتنا اليوم علمية وراح تكون تحديدا من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية ومن مدينة بوسطن، وعلى وجه الخصوص من جامعة هارڤارد اللي راح نستضيف فيها الدكتور مارك سيدنر. على ما يجوز الاتصال، خلوني في البداية أرحب بزميلي اللي راح يشاركني في تقديم هذه الحلقة، الدكتور محمد جمال. دكتور محمد، مساء الخير.
مساء النور. هلا أبو عبد العزيز.
حلقتنا اليوم علمية، احنا يمكن حلقتنا الأولى اللي استضفنا فيها الدكتور آيزاك بوغوش، الحمد لله رب العالمين كان فيها تفاعل جدا واسع. كثير من متابعين البرنامج طلبوا احنا نكرر مثل هذه اللقاءات العلمية، بحيث ان نحاول قدر المستطاع ان نقدم مشاهدين مادة علمية دقيقة. واليوم يعني وقع الاختيار على أحد أبرز الدكاترة في جامعة هارڤارد. كلمنا في البداية بشكل موجز عن دكتور مارك.
طبعا المرض قاعد يتطور يوم بعد يوم، الأبحاث قاعد تتغير يوم بعد يوم، بالدقيقة الأبحاث قاعد تتغير، فالمعلومات جدا ديناميكية، بالتالي الاستضافة هذه شخصيات مهمة. دكتور سيدنر في جامعة هارڤارد وفي ماس جنرال هوسبيتال، واحد أهم مستشفيات العالم بحثيا وكلينيكيا، وله العديد من الأبحاث في علم الڤيروسات والأوبئة. عنده الكثير من الأبحاث في قارة أفريقيا على الملاريا، أدوية الملاريا، على الHIV اللي هو مرض الإيدز، وله أكثر من 3500 استشهاد بحثي، فهو باحث مهم من جامعة مهمة ومتخصص تخصص مهم في الڤيروسات.
طيب، احنا اتصور الاتصال الى الان مو جاهز، على ما يجوز الاتصال ان شاء الله من بوسطن خلينا نشوف مع بعض التقرير ونبدأ حلقتنا ان شاء الله. Dr. Mark?
Yes, good morning, good afternoon.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening here in Kuwait. It's great to have you, Dr. Mark, in this program.
Thank you, pleased to be here.
Dr. Mark, let's start first from the United States, especially in New York. What went wrong in New York?
Well, I think this epidemic is one that, in some regards, caught us all a little off guard. You know, this was something that I think has revealed that our public health infrastructure, both here in the United States and in many places in the world, wasn't really ready for a shock like this to our system. And so I think it came a little faster than we were prepared for. There were certainly areas that we should have been better at. We should have gotten testing out earlier. We should have been better at public awareness campaigns and our ability to respond to severe epidemics. And I think what we're seeing now in the United States is a slow start has resulted in a relatively large epidemic, but also some beginnings to see some signs of change and some hope for the good, which I do think we hope will continue over the next days and weeks.
What are the good signs that you are referring to in terms of the epidemic in the United States?
Well, I think every day brings a new day, and so certainly cautious to make any strong conclusions, but there are parts of the United States, including in New York and including in places like Seattle, which was one of the early epicenters of the epidemic here, where you are starting to see what we call the bending of the curve a bit, which is the number of new cases each day has started to slow. The goal really is to get that number down into the point where there's less and less new cases, and you can start to control the epidemic by limiting transmission, decreasing the needs for hospital beds, and overall, eventually, maintain a return to normalcy.
Dr. Mark, you mentioned the main reason in New York is the slow beginning.
Yeah, well, so we know that this virus transmits rapidly. It's much more like influenza than some other recent epidemics that we've seen. Things that have also got news attention, things like Ebola, for example, are much more difficult to transmit because of the way it's transmitted than a disease like SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19. that the ability for it to transmit so quickly means that there's a very short period of time when the virus enters the community where there is an opportunity potentially to get on top of it before it starts to transmit locally. Once it is starting to transmit locally, the options are much more difficult, much more challenging, and you can find that if in a place like New York, where you have incredible population density, transmission happens in very large numbers, and when that happens, it can overwhelm the healthcare system.
It seems that patients usually do well for the first week once they develop symptoms, and then some immunological reaction a week after starts to kick in that causes severe disease. Do you think that treating patients early, even with mild symptoms, will improve the outcome in terms of mortality?
It's a great question. I mean, I think we need to remember that about 80% of people who we know get infected, which is probably maybe some proportion of all the people that are infected, do just fine. You know, don't even really get sick. They feel like they have a cold, potentially some muscle aches or low-grade fevers, but it goes away in a week or two. What we don't really know is about those other 20%, the best way to manage them, and whether everyone should be treated or we should just treat some people who are getting sick. It's completely true that there seems to be a two-humped curve to this infection, and that many people feel like they have the flu or an upper respiratory tract infection for a week, and it's not until the second week that they start having the signs of pneumonia and shortness of breath. We need to figure out how to prevent the pneumonia in these people, because it's those complications that's really causing much of the harm. There are a number of studies going on right now, not looking at treatments for the virus, but looking at treatments basically of the immune system, immunosuppressing agents, with the idea, the hope that that reaction that you just mentioned, that inflammatory response that comes about in the second week of the infection, can be prevented if we clamp down the body's immune system and its reaction to the infection. Those studies are quite preliminary, but we're hoping to have some data in the next at least 2 or 3 weeks to help understand if those treatments, not antivirals, may actually be a key to helping to control the disease related to this epidemic.
It's the first time I hear about the use of immunosuppression in studies for this virus. What kind of immunosuppression are they talking about? ATG, azathioprine? Is it the sort of immunosuppression used in transplant patients?
Good question. So the biggest study I'm aware of is a medicine called tocilizumab, which is an anti-IL-6 agonist. So basically it inhibits one of the body's immune responses to the virus itself. That's the study that's currently undergoing clinical trials. There's a number of other similar clinical trials using similar IL-6 inhibitors, although not that medicine. The data from China has been conflicting, I have to say. There are some studies in China that have looked at corticosteroids, which are another immunosuppressing agent. Those have given us pause because in SARS, the initial SARS, it's clear that steroids from multiple studies appear to be harmful. Also, in a number of studies that have looked at the use of steroids for people with other forms of this kind of inflammatory pneumonia, which we call ARDS, or acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is the body's reaction to infection that causes pneumonia. In those other kinds of diseases, steroids have not been useful. So there's a lot of data that suggests that maybe steroids shouldn't be used in people with this condition. That said, 2 non-controlled, so not the best studies, but 2 early studies in China have looked at low-dose steroids for the treatment of this infection, and they did show preliminarily some beneficial effects. And so I know there are some groups in the United States that are now considering a much larger trial of the use of steroids in this condition to see if it prevents the ARDS and the other pneumonia complications that we've seen.
Now, when would you consider a patient cured, and what would you instruct your patients on discharge? We interviewed a doctor from the UK here last week who got infected, but then he went back to work right away as soon as the symptoms disappeared. So I'm curious to know, what is your protocol of discharge?
Good question. So what we know mostly from China data and emerging from other countries is that unlike influenza, people tend to shed this virus in the secretions from their nose and their mouth for 2 to 3 weeks. So it looks like, especially for sick people, you can expect that you can still find virus for 2 to 3 weeks after the time of symptoms onset. That's unlike influenza, where really a couple days after you're done having symptoms, the vast majority of people no longer have virus detectable. I think a major question that no one has answered and we need to answer is whether that virus is still infectious. So is it just that there's virus there which we can detect on our testing platforms, or are they still contagious? We haven't answered that question yet. Until we answer that question, most people are recommending 2 weeks after symptoms begin or 48 hours after symptoms end, whichever is latest, to try to ensure that people that were infectious are no longer transmitting to other people. So that's what we're doing for our employees and our healthcare workers. That's what we're recommending to people that are infected and are at home, is to expect that they're still infectious for at least 2 weeks after symptoms begin. What we have tried to do in the hospital is to really ensure that people are negative before we put them in places where they may be putting other people in danger. And so the early data from China has shown that one negative test is not necessarily sufficient. That's also been shown in Seattle. So we are, in many cases, especially when we have a relatively high suspicion for disease, sometimes testing people twice, at least 24 to 48 hours apart, to make sure that they're negative before we send them, for example, to a nursing home or to a shelter where they'll be in contact with many other people.
Dr. Mark, we don't have any randomized studies result on drugs and treatment of COVID-19. As an expert, what do you think is the treatment that would prevail?
Great. So good question. There's actually been one small study of 200 people that was just recently published, actually looking at an HIV regimen, which preliminarily appeared potentially to be effective in this. Unfortunately, that study did not show benefit of this drug in this condition. People have asked maybe it was the wrong dose. People have asked maybe it was at the wrong point of disease. These were people that were already in the hospital and a bit sick. So as you suggested, maybe it was too late in the course of the disease. And others have just suggested maybe these aren't the right drugs. And so there was some original interest in HIV drugs. I think that study has made us a little bit less interested in HIV drugs. My general sense today is, listen, we don't have enough data to be sure about this, so we just need to use our best judgment. Of course, there's been a lot of press about the malaria agents. Those look promising in vitro. There's some prior data in other similar viruses that those are effective, especially with hydroxychloroquine. It's a relatively safe medicine, and so in certain populations who don't have heart problems, it can be tried. There's some data on azithromycin, which is an antibiotic. That, again, in non-randomized data, that looks promising. So I think at this point, what we're asking ourselves are there regimens which at least conceivably may have some effect? Are they relatively safe in the patients we're using them in? If so, let's go ahead and use them until the data gets better. We want to make sure we're preventing morbidity, preventing mortality. And meanwhile, there's probably hundreds of studies going on right now trying to find the most effective, the best tolerated, and frankly, the most available medicines. That data is coming out. Unlike vaccines, we're going to have therapeutic data, I would say, within the next month, and help advise ourselves on really what's the best strategy here.
That's great news. Giving us some hope that we will get some data on therapeutics in a month. Now, what do you think of plasma exchange and plasma transfusion? And if we are going to go ahead with that, when would you recommend blood banks to get patients who got cured from the virus to come and donate their plasma?
Good question. So, listen, we need to have a quiver of arrows. We need a whole group of things that might work, and we need to test them all now, okay? So there's no question that we should be using all of our means necessary, especially in places like the United States where we have the resources to be doing clinical trials, to be turning over every rock we can find. You know, is it therapeutics? Is it plasma exchange? Some people are using inhaled nitric oxide to help improve oxygenation of the lungs. We should try everything at our disposal, find what works, and once we find that, disseminate it widely. Plasma exchange, conceptually, is a really good idea, right? So what are you doing? You're taking people that have recovered from the disease and that we can detect have antibodies that are effective at neutralizing the virus. You're taking those antibodies out of people and you're giving them to people who are either sick or infected with the disease so that their immune system can clear the disease. The concept is quite strong. There's early data that shows, at least in humans that are recovering from the illness, that their antibodies do rise as the virus levels fall, which strongly suggests that the antibodies, doesn't prove, but strongly suggests the antibodies have something to do with the response to the virus and the recovery. And there's some data now actually in apes, in macaques, that shows if you infect macaques, they do develop antibodies, and then if you reinfect them, they are protected from infection. These are all really strong pieces of evidence that something like plasma exchange might work. What don't we know? We don't know if it works. So there's one study that got a lot of press the last few days that was published in a high-impact journal, which demonstrated 5 people in China that were quite ill, with infection, people with the pneumonia, the severe form, and they each received plasma exchange from people who had recovered and had clear evidence of very high titers of antibody in their blood. All 5 of those people improved to some extent. 3 of them were discharged. 2 of them remained in the hospital after a few weeks, but were doing better. What's the problem with that study? Of course, it's not randomized and there's no control group. Right. So how would those people have done had they not gotten antibodies? We just can't say for sure. And so what we're waiting for is these larger studies, and there are studies now ongoing, to look at plasma exchange, antibody-mediated transfusion to be able to protect people who are sick with this disease. My personal feeling is that although it's possible to do, it's certainly not as easy as a pill that we can mass produce or maybe is already mass produced. It should be one of the things that we're testing. It could be an effective and potentially the most effective agent. Once it's proven to some degree that it truly works, that's when you shift and start putting your resources in it. My general sense is that today, because of how complicated and potentially expensive it is, especially for many areas, it wouldn't be the first thing I choose, but it would certainly be amongst the things I'm thinking about.
Dr. Mark, regarding the testing is important, we know, and we saw a few days ago that the FDA approved a new PCR test from Abbott that gets you the result in 15 minutes. What are the best tests in general?
So every test needs to be tailored to its purpose. So I don't think there's not one test that's perfect for everyone. So let me give you an example. At my hospital, when we're going to see hundreds of people a day, and we actually take tests from local community centers, from a few different referral sites, from ambulatory sites, we need to be able to bring those tests into our lab and test hundreds or potentially thousands of tests a day. So at a hospital, what you want is the machinery to be able to do very high throughput testing and to you basically get your sample size as high as possible. If you're a community-based organization that's going out in the community and doing case finding, and you want to go into someone's home and try to figure out if them and their family might be infected, and Abbott does have a machine that allows you in your van to be able to test people and get results in 15 minutes, that's a fantastic technology that should be used. And so what I think we need, frankly, is as many different testing platforms as possible. Make the testing platforms fit for purpose. So if you're working in a large lab, you need a large machine with high throughput. If you're working in the community, you need a rapid test to get people answers as soon as possible. We need to combine those things to get all the tests where they need it. When this epidemic started, especially in the United States, testing was a privilege. Who got tested? A very few people meeting very specific criteria and some specific people who needed it. We need to change our mindset drastically from thinking that only certain people are allowed to get COVID testing to a point where everyone who is symptomatic needs testing, and we get them testing so we know where the epidemic is, we know the size of the epidemic, we know where to basically place our resources, and we know how to respond properly. And I'm hoping, very strongly hoping, that as throughput increases both here and elsewhere in the world, as the technologies improve, as we get those technologies in places like Kuwait and elsewhere, that we're able to actually provide everyone who needs a test so they can respond and the public health community can respond.
Right. Now, we applied, here in Kuwait, we have applied social distancing methods pretty early in the course. We actually have a partial curfew for about 12 hours a day. It might go into a complete curfew. The president of the WHO last week was telling us that immobilization methods will help you buy time to do testing. My question is, when can we ease off those social, those immobilization methods in Kuwait?
That's the question I think every one of us wants an answer to. These social distancing measures have been implemented all over the world. They're here in the United States. Schools are shut down. Workplaces are shut down. The economy is struggling because of this. There's no question about it. I think we are all desperate to answer the question, how much is enough, and when can we change? And I will say that if you look to a country like China,
right,
that is probably the only country now that we can say very clearly had a clear epidemic, responded to the epidemic, and was able, for the most part, at least to today, to control that epidemic. They really set a standard that I'm not sure most countries can meet, but they did show it is possible. How did they do that? Even after a pretty large epidemic had started, they implemented very severe social distancing measures, and then they implemented a program where every single case was resulted in quarantine. Every single case resulted in contact tracing, where all of the contacts in the home were also tested Those cases were quarantined, and they were able to separate the cases from the non-cases and get epidemic control. Right. In a perfect world, right, just say social distancing worked 100% of the time, and you took every person in your society and you removed them, and they all had to stand 6 feet apart. 2 weeks later, right, everyone who'd been infected when you started that would now have symptoms, and you would know for sure that they're infected. 2 weeks after that, the epidemic would be over.
Right.
So if you could do a perfect social distancing program in 1 month, I can guarantee your epidemic is over if your borders don't allow other people to come in. How much is enough? Is a month enough? It really depends on how strict they are, whether people are actually participating in those, and whether, as you said, testing is in place where the cases can be detected, they can be separated and quarantined appropriately. If you can do that, then I think 2 to 4 weeks is enough. If you can't do that, what you'll find is that at any moment the epidemic could reoccur, and that you'll be stuck in the same place you were a month before it started.
Right.
So I think we'll have some pretty good evidence in the next few weeks, once again, as we watch all these countries around the world start to do social distancing measures, that it works well. And we'll start to have an idea of how soon is soon enough to relax those measures and allow people to go back to normalcy, start to put this epidemic behind us.
Dr. Mark, we saw that nurses in New York, which is one of the richest cities worldwide, are wearing garbage material instead of proper protective gown. When we see this in our region, it sends a very scary message. We don't have the industry here in Kuwait, so how can we prepare better?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that this epidemic is teaching us a lot. It's teaching us whether or not we're prepared for public health emergencies. And I think we've learned that this epidemic, I hope we've learned this epidemic can force us to prepare for the future and to say, never again will be in a place where we're asking frontline health workers, we're asking our police, our firemen, the people who we rely on every day to make sure that we are protected when we're in danger, that they are prepared to respond to things like this. And I think the Ebola epidemic has always been a confined epidemic. And so although it's scary, it always seemed like something happening somewhere else. The MERS epidemic, for example, is a scary epidemic, but it also often feels like it's happening somewhere else. It doesn't affect us personally. If COVID has done nothing else, hopefully it's convinced us that we're a small planet. We are all in communication. We are all in contact with each other. Infections can tear through our planet, and we need to be prepared as a society to make sure we can respond to them. We know how to do this. Frankly, we've known how to do this for a couple hundred years. It's that we weren't prepared, and we got caught off guard, and when it finally came, we weren't able to protect the people adequately that needed to be protected. I will say that there are, of course, going to be stories that are frightening and startling. I will say that much of what you're seeing in New York is an incredibly committed healthcare workforce that, despite limitations in some of the equipment they have, is showing up to work every day and really, I think, going above and beyond the call of duty to protect the patients in their hospitals. So I actually think in some ways these stories are reassuring in that they are showing the dedication of the people that we know who are basically in the trenches every day to do what they need to do. But that should be a message to all of us. Personal protective equipment, effective healthcare institutions, effective hospitals, the ability to receive patients, no matter the number, even if we're not ready for them, needs to be part of our public health preparedness plans. Testing programs, testing platforms, contact tracing platforms, emergency preparedness and response, that needs to be part of our basic fundamental package of public health care in all countries, rich and poor, so that when these epidemics occur, we're ready to prepare for them.
Okay, what do you think, Dr. Mark, of the British approach and what they said about herd immunity?
So, modeling studies have generally shown that for herd immunity to be effective and to prevent infections, somewhere between 50 and 80% of the population needs to have been infected and then protect those amongst them from getting further infected. I personally do not think that we as society should accept a 50 to 80% infection rate. We as society should accept the lowest possible infection rate that we can manage we need to protect those amongst us who are most susceptible to severe disease, the elderly amongst us, those with comorbidities. Allowing 50 to 80% of our population to be infected, with a mortality rate of this infection ranging from 1% to 3%, is like saying we're okay with 2 to 3% of our population dying. I'm an optimist perhaps, and not a cynic, and I don't think, if that is a strategy that some countries are proposing, I don't think that's the strategy that most of us should aspire to. We don't need to do that. We can prevent that from happening, and I think that all of us should be trying to do so.
Are there any positive news to share with us in this epidemic so far?
I do think there's a lot of positive news, frankly. Again, I'm maybe an optimist, but we've seen places like China, places like Singapore, places like South Korea, who are the earlier stages of the epidemic, demonstrate that public health responses to severe epidemics are possible. That epidemics can be controlled, even when they're scary, even when they're transmitted rapidly, even when they have reasonably high mortality rates, that there are strategies that work. So we can learn from our neighbors, we can learn from our partners, and we can use those strategies also to protect ourselves. 1, 2, a story about someone reusing PPE makes news, right? That's one that's going to get on the internet.
Yeah.
There are many other stories that aren't making news.
Right.
At my hospital, a team of doctors has partnered with the Department of Public Health and partners to build quarantine centers and shelters for all the homeless people in our city who don't have a place to quarantine, because if you're homeless, sheltering in place for 2 weeks means nothing because there's nowhere else for you to go.
Right.
I have seen doctors and nurses work tirelessly multiple shifts to make sure that they can take care of their communities. I have seen tremendous amounts of volunteerism and donations. MGH is a hospital which is highly prioritizes research. It's one of the largest research centers in the country.
True.
Massive outpourings of the research community who've had to shut down their research programs in the setting of an epidemic, donating supplies, reagents, kits, machines, PPE from their labs to patients, to hospitals, to respond to this epidemic. So, and as much as some of the news we're seeing is quite scary, I think some of the less documented stories out there, which I hope will get shared more, have shown resilience, community, the ability for our society to come together in times of crisis and not separate. And that does give me hope. I think that we can overcome this virus, this epidemic. I think we can learn from it. And I hope, beyond all hopes, that we'll use this to prepare for the next one, because there will be a next one. This is something that I think we can expect in the future.
Yeah.
Dr. Mark, my last question, how long do you think we will live under the threat of this virus?
Well, this virus itself, it's a little hard to predict. I think most countries have shown that the peak epidemic happens between 2 and 3 months after the first few cases are reported. There's a pretty standard trajectory where the epidemic doubles every 2 to 3 days in the early courses of the epidemic. And then various public health measures and other measures are put in place. You start to see that curve bend to flatten out and start to resolve. I'm hoping that if we as a world and as a series of nations can work together, we can get that to happen in most countries, and that in the next 3 to 6 months, we can largely find ways to overcome this virus together. I will say that no matter what happens, as I've mentioned, it should be a lesson for us, and we shouldn't forget the lessons from COVID-19. We should use them to strengthen our public health community, to strengthen our healthcare systems, so that inevitably when this happens again, with a different virus at a different time, we're better prepared and we can respond to it much more quickly than we did now.
Dr. Mark Sيدنر from Boston, we really enjoy talking to you. Thank you and stay safe.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you.
واضح أن الدكتور مارك متفائل نوعا ما، وهذا يعني مؤشر إيجابي على الأقل يطمنا في أمريكا.
طبعا تبين أول شيء استشهد بتجربة الصين وكوريا الجنوبية وكيف أن استطاعوا التحكم بهذا الوباء، فكان بالنسبة له هذا شيء باعث على التفاؤل. كذلك ردة فعل المجتمع الطبي والخدمات الطبية المساندة ضد هذا الفيروس أيضا أمر آخر دعا إلى التفاؤل. الشيء الجميل اللي قاله، يمكن من أجمل الأشياء اللي قالها بالمقابلة، أن خلال شهر الآن مسألة التطعيم راح تأخذ تقريبا سنة. احنا ما تكلمنا عن التطعيم، ولكن الشيء الجميل أنه ذكر خلال شهر إلى شهرين راح نوصل إلى علاجات مهمة ونتائج الأبحاث على العلاجات ستكون متوفرة خلال شهر إلى شهرين. من هذه العلاجات اللي ذكرها علاج الملاريا، وكذلك نقل البلازما. فهذه أشياء جميلة وداعية إلى التفاؤل، إن إذا خلال شهر قدرنا نوصل حق علاجات مهمة، أعتقد هذا الشيء راح يكون ممتاز. استخدام الفحوصات، ذكر استخدام الفحوصات، لازم نستخدم نوعين من الفحوصات، فحص ممتاز في المستشفيات الكبيرة، وفحص متنقل سريع نفس فحص أبت اللي حضرتك سألت عنه، اللي يعطيك النتيجة خلال ربع ساعة. هذا الفحص تقدر تروح فيه حق بيت الشخص، أو من خلال السيارات تقدر تسويه وتعرف النتيجة.
هو ياخذ 13 إلى 15 دقيقة وتطلع النتيجة على طول.
وإذا قدرنا احنا نفحص بسرعة ونعزل الناس بسرعة، راح نقدر نتحكم بهذا الوباء بطريقة سهلة ونرجع إلى حياتنا الطبيعية إن شاء الله.
على طار التحكم بالوباء، واحدة من الأمور الملفتة اللي ذكرها في البداية لما تحدث تحديدا عن مدينة نيويورك، وقال أن السبب الأساسي والرئيسي من اللي حصل أو قاعد يحصل الآن في نيويورك هو تأخرهم في اتخاذ الإجراءات، سواء من قبل مدينة نيويورك، سواء من قبل الولاية نفسها أو من قبل الناس.
صحيح.
هذا أدى إلى تفاقم المشكلة.
صحيح. بس المشكلة الكبرى في الولايات المتحدة كانت إجراء الفحوصات. مثل ما ذكر هو، قال إنه كان بريفليج، كان ميزة إنك تقدر تسوي الفحص، ما أي واحد كان يقدر يسوي الفحص بصعوبة جدا. لو تذكر في من أوائل حالات الوفاة في كاليفورنيا اللي سيدة كانت في الإنعاش مدة طويلة، الدكاترة يتصلون يطلبون من مركز التحكم الأمريكي إنه يوافقون لهم موافقة علشان إجراء فحص سارس كوفي 2. المركز كان يرفض مرتين ثلاثة، يلا قبلوا وبعدين فحصوا المرأة وطلعت مصابة بالمرأة وطلعت مصابة بالمرض.
هذا موضوع مهم. هو هل ما كانوا مستشعرين الأمريكان بأهمية بخطورة هذا الفيروس؟ هل كانوا متساهلين بشكل كبير؟ الحين بدأوا يستوعبون الموضوع. يعني أمريكا تصدرت الحين العالم في عدد الإصابات.
نعم.
ويمكن إذا سمعت يعني المؤتمر الصحفي حق الرئيس الأمريكي دونالد ترامب، متوقع الأعداد اللي راح يتوفون راح تزداد بشكل كبير جدا. هل فعلا هو ما كانوا مستشعرين، متساهلين بالموضوع؟
أنا أعتقد المجتمع العلمي كان مستشعر إنه راح يجي فيروس جديد. لو في محاضرة في تيد لبيل جيتس سنة 2015 مشاهدينها أظن 8 مليون أو ما شابه، يذكر فيها أنه راح يكون في غزو لفيروس جديد. الكورونا ضربنا سنة 2003، ضرب العالم، ضرب مرة ثانية سنة 2012، والعلماء كانوا من 2003 يقولون يا جماعة راح يجي كورونا ثاني، فيروس ثاني، وراح يضرب العالم بطريقة قوية. فالكل كان عارف، ولكن لم يكن هناك استعداد، لم يكن هناك إصغاء
في المجال العلمي،
ولكن ليس في المجال السياسي. لم يكن هناك إصغاء من السياسيين كما يبدو. الفحوصات لم تكن متوفرة. حاكم ولاية كاليفورنيا نهاية شهر 2 طلع وتكلم، قال أنا ما عندي إلا قدرة أني أسوي 200 فحص في ولاية كاليفورنيا، وهي ولاية كبيرة جدا. فبالتالي لم يكن هناك إصغاء سياسي.
طيب، هي مشكلتنا احنا دائما تكون تداخل السياسة خصوصا في مجال العلم، لكن مرة ثانية احنا يمكن نأكد على الجزئية المهمة اللي قالها
يعني. نعم.
بكل تأكيد، لكن احنا نأكد أيضا على الجزئية المهمة اللي ذكرها الدكتور مارك قبل شوية من جامعة هارڤارد، اللي هو أنه متفائل أن خلال شهر إلى شهرين ماكسيموم راح نوصل لعلاجات مهمة. إن شاء الله نكون احنا أيضا قدمنا في هذه الحلقة جرعة علمية للسادة المشاهدين، ووضحنا بعض الأمور إن شاء الله، لكن أيضا راح نكمل إن شاء الله حلقاتنا المتخصصة العلمية مع دكاترة آخرين. كل الشكر لك أستاذ مشارك في جامعة الكويت دكتور محمد جمال، حياك الله. شكر موصول لكم مشاهدينا الكرام. في تفاؤل على الرغم من كل هذا المشهد اللي قاعد نشوفه والإجراءات المشددة، لكن العلماء قاعدين يأكدون بشكل يومي أن الأبحاث مستمرة وهناك جرعة تفاؤل. نحتاج نصبر شوي ونلتزم مرة ثانية وثالثة ورابعة بتعليمات منظمة الصحة العالمية وتعليمات وزارة الصحة الكويتية أن نلتزم البقاء في المنزل وعدم الخروج إلا للضرورة القصوى جدا. نقدر نعدي هالأزمة وراح نعديها بإذن الله، لكن محتاجين نتعاون مع بعض ونلتزم هذه التعليمات كلها. الله يحفظكم من كل شر، نشوفكم على خير، في أمان الله.